She sat there wounded and silent, until the SEAL medic questioned her training. The room was loud. Metal chairs scraped across the floor, soldiers laughed, and the low hum of conversations filled the training hall. It was another routine afternoon inside the naval training facility. Medics, recruits, and instructors were gathered for a joint briefing. But the noise slowly faded when the door opened. A young woman stepped inside. She moved slowly, carefully, as if every step required effort. Her uniform was clean, but something about her stood out immediately. Her left arm was wrapped in thick bandages, and a dark bruise stretched across the side of her neck. Some of the recruits glanced at her and whispered. Others simply stared. A wounded soldier walking into a room full of trainees was unusual enough, but the strange part was her silence. She didn't greet anyone. She didn't look around. She simply walked toward the back of the room and sat down quietly. Across the room, one of the instructors noticed her. He was a veteran Navy SEAL medic, known for his sharp eyes and even sharper questions. Nothing unusual slipped past him for long. He crossed his arms and studied the newcomer carefully. Something didn't add up. Wounded soldiers didn't usually attend fresh training briefings. And if they did, they certainly didn't sit silently in the back like ghosts. The medic leaned toward another instructor. "Who's that?" he asked quietly. The other man shrugged. "No idea." That answer didn't satisfy him. Minutes later, the briefing began. The instructor at the front started explaining advanced battlefield medical response techniques. Most recruits listened carefully, taking notes and watching every movement. But the wounded woman remained completely still. She didn't write anything. She didn't ask questions. She simply watched. Her eyes followed every movement of the instructor's hands, every demonstration, every detail. The SEAL medic noticed. At first he thought she might just be nervous. But after 10 minutes, something started bothering him. Most recruits showed confusion or curiosity during complicated demonstrations. She showed neither. Instead, she looked calm. Too calm. As if she had seen it all before. Finally, the medic couldn't ignore it anymore. He stood up from his chair. The room fell quiet as he walked toward the back. Boots echoed softly against the floor. Every recruit turned to watch. He stopped directly in front of the wounded woman. She slowly looked up at him. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then the medic gestured toward her bandaged arm. His voice was calm, but direct. "You're injured," he said. The room stayed silent. "You shouldn't even be in this training session." A few recruits nodded quietly. That seemed obvious. The medic studied her expression carefully before continuing. "So tell me something," he said. "Who exactly approved you for this training?" The question hung in the air. Every pair of eyes in the room shifted toward the quiet soldier. Some recruits expected her to apologize. Others expected her to leave. But she didn't move. She didn't look embarrassed. Instead, she slowly straightened in her chair. And when she finally spoke, her voice was calm, steady, and surprisingly confident. "I've already completed this training," she said quietly. The room went completely silent. Some recruits exchanged confused looks. The medic frowned slightly. Completed this training? That didn't make sense. He crossed his arms again and leaned forward slightly. "Completed it where?" he asked. The wounded soldier held his gaze. For a moment, it looked like she might say something important. She simply said one sentence. A sentence that made the medic pause for the first time. "You might want to ask your commander." And suddenly, the room felt a lot more serious. The room remained completely silent after her words. "You might want to ask your commander." Several recruits shifted in their seats. A few exchanged confused looks, unsure whether the wounded soldier was being serious or simply arrogant. The SEAL medic studied her face carefully. He had spent years working beside elite operators, soldiers who had seen the worst situations imaginable. He knew how confidence looked. And this woman sitting quietly in front of him carried that same calm confidence. But something still didn't add up. He glanced again at the heavy bandage around her arm. "You completed this training already?" he repeated. She nodded once. The medic exhaled slowly and stepped back, crossing his arms again. Then maybe you won't mind helping us, he said. Several recruits leaned forward with interest. At the front of the room, the instructor had been demonstrating a complicated battlefield medical procedure, treating a soldier with severe bleeding while under pressure. Most recruits struggled to memorize the steps. The medic gestured toward the demonstration table. Since you've already completed the training, he said, why don't you show the class how it's done? A few quiet chuckles came from the back of the room. Some recruits clearly believed the wounded soldier had just talked herself into embarrassment. After all, she was injured. Her arm was barely usable, and the procedure required speed, strength, and precision. But the woman didn't argue. She slowly stood up. The room watched carefully as she walked toward the front. Her steps were steady, but cautious. The medic placed a medical training dummy on the table and pointed at it. Simulated arterial bleed, he explained. 3 minutes to stabilize the patient. Several recruits exchanged skeptical looks. Even healthy trainees sometimes failed this test. And she was wounded. The medic stepped aside. Whenever you're ready. For a moment, the room held its breath. The woman looked down at the dummy. Her eyes moved quickly across the equipment laid out on the table, gauze, tourniquets, clamps. Then something unexpected happened. She didn't rush. She didn't panic. Instead, she calmly removed the bandage from her injured arm. The room gasped softly. Underneath the bandage was a deep scar, old but clearly painful. Yet she moved the arm carefully, as if she had already learned to ignore the pain. Then the timer started. 3 minutes. Most recruits would begin searching frantically through the medical tools. She didn't. Her hands moved with smooth precision. Tourniquet applied. Pressure packed. Clamp positioned. Every motion was quick, efficient, almost automatic. The medic's expression slowly changed. This wasn't luck. This wasn't someone guessing their way through training. This was experience. Real experience. 30 seconds passed. Then 1 minute. The recruits who had been whispering earlier now sat completely still. They watched as the wounded soldier finished the stabilization procedure with calm, controlled movements. Then she stepped back. The timer still showed 1 minute remaining. The room fell silent. The medic walked forward slowly and examined the dummy. Tourniquet placement was perfect. Bleeding point sealed. Airway clear. It was flawless. He looked back at her. The same woman everyone had doubted minutes ago now stood quietly beside the table, her injured arm hanging calmly at her side. Finally, the medic spoke. His voice was much quieter this time. Where exactly did you learn that? The recruits leaned forward, waiting for the answer. The woman looked at him calmly. Then she said something that made the room freeze. I didn't learn it here. The medic frowned. Then where? She paused for a moment, and when she answered, even the instructors in the room felt the tension change. I learned it, she said quietly, on real missions. And suddenly, the medic realized he might be speaking to someone very different from an ordinary trainee. The room stayed silent after her answer. I learned it on real missions. Several recruits looked at each other in confusion. Real missions? Most of them had only just begun their training. Some had never even stepped outside a controlled exercise field. Hearing someone casually mention real missions inside a classroom felt almost unbelievable. The SEAL medic narrowed his eyes slightly. He had heard many stories over the years. Some soldiers exaggerated their experience, others tried to impress people in training environments. But something about this woman didn't feel like a lie. She wasn't bragging. She wasn't trying to impress anyone. If anything, she sounded like she was simply stating a fact. The medic folded his arms again. Real missions, he repeated slowly. And where exactly were those missions? The recruits leaned forward, waiting for her answer. But before she could speak, the door to the training hall suddenly opened. Heavy boots stepped inside. Every instructor in the room immediately straightened. A tall officer walked in. The moment the recruits saw the insignia on his uniform, several of them quietly sat up straighter. It was the training commander. His presence alone was enough to silence the entire room. The commander's eyes scanned the hall quickly, then stopped. They landed directly on the wounded woman standing beside the medical table. For a brief second, his expression changed. Not confusion. Recognition. The SEAL medic noticed it immediately. The commander walked forward calmly. The room stayed completely silent as he approached. The medic stepped toward him. "Sir," he said, nodding respectfully. "We were just—" But the commander gently raised a hand, stopping him. His eyes never left the woman. For a moment, the two of them simply looked at each other. Then something surprising happened. The wounded soldier stood straighter. Not like a recruit. Not like someone nervous in front of a superior officer. But like someone who understood military discipline perfectly. The commander stopped a few steps away from her. The room waited. Finally, the medic spoke again. "Sir," he said carefully, "this trainee claims she completed this training already, and says she learned these procedures on real missions." The commander glanced briefly at the medical dummy on the table. He immediately noticed the perfectly executed treatment. Then he looked back at the woman. A faint smile appeared on his face. "Well," the commander said calmly, "that would make sense." The medic blinked. "Sir?" Several recruits leaned forward in confusion. The commander turned toward the class. "You see," he said, "she isn't here to learn this training." The room grew even quieter. The medic frowned slightly. "Then why is she here?" The commander looked back at the wounded soldier. Then he said something that sent a wave of whispers through the room. "She's here to evaluate it." The recruits stared in disbelief. "Evaluate it?" The medic looked stunned. "But she's injured," he said. The commander nodded slowly. "Yes," he replied. "Injured during her last operation." The room went completely still. Now every recruit in the hall was staring at the quiet woman who had walked in unnoticed only minutes earlier. The commander continued speaking. "Before she was reassigned here temporarily." He paused. Then he finished the sentence. "She served as a combat medic attached to a Navy SEAL unit." Several recruits gasped quietly. The medic himself looked shocked. He turned back toward the wounded woman. The same quiet soldier he had questioned only moments ago was suddenly someone very different. And the most surprising part? She had never tried to prove it. She had simply walked in, sat down, and watched. The commander folded his arms. "And if I'm not mistaken," he added calmly, "she's probably the most experienced medic in this room." The silence that followed felt heavier than anything before. And for the first time since the training began, no one doubted the quiet wounded soldier anymore. The room was completely silent. Moments earlier, the recruits had been whispering and laughing quietly at the wounded soldier sitting in the back row. Now no one spoke. No one even moved. Every pair of eyes in the training hall was fixed on her. The woman who had walked in quietly, injured and silent, was suddenly someone entirely different. The SEAL medic stood still for a moment, processing what the commander had just said. A combat medic, attached to a Navy SEAL unit. And here he was, questioning whether she even belonged in the room. The medic slowly looked back at the medical table. The perfect procedure. The calm movements. The confidence. Now it all made sense. He took a slow breath and stepped closer to her. For the first time since the conversation began, his voice carried a different tone. "Respect." "I didn't realize," he said quietly. The woman didn't react dramatically. She simply nodded once. "I didn't come here to be introduced," she replied calmly. A few recruits lowered their eyes, slightly embarrassed by their earlier whispers. The commander stepped forward beside them. "She requested to observe the training," he explained to the room. "After her last mission, she was temporarily pulled from active duty while recovering." The commander glanced briefly at her injured arm. "But before she returns to the field, she's been reviewing several training programs." The recruits listened carefully now. Every word mattered. The commander looked across the room. "And today," he continued, "she was here to see how well our future medics perform under pressure." The room suddenly felt different. Earlier, the trainees believed they were simply attending another lesson. Now they realized something else entirely. They had been tested without even knowing it. The SEAL medic crossed his arms again, but this time it wasn't out of doubt. It was admiration. "You handled that procedure with one arm," he said. That's not something most trainees could do. The woman glanced briefly at her injured arm. You learn to adapt, she replied simply. One of the recruits near the front finally spoke up. His voice was hesitant. Ma'am, were you really performing those procedures during missions? The room waited for her answer. She looked at him calmly. Then she gave a small nod. More times than I can count. The recruits exchanged quiet looks. Suddenly the training exercise they had struggled with moments earlier felt very real. The commander placed a hand on the table. Training rooms are safe, he said. But out there, mistakes cost lives. He looked toward the woman beside him. That's why experience like hers matters. The SEAL medic turned to face the class. All right, he said. Everyone just witnessed how it's supposed to be done. The recruits straightened in their seats. But before the session continued, the medic did something unexpected. He turned toward the wounded soldier again. Then he gave a short, respectful nod. Not the casual nod of a colleague. The nod of someone acknowledging skill earned under real pressure. The woman returned the gesture quietly. No pride. No celebration. Just quiet professionalism. The commander finally stepped back toward the door. All right, he said. Training continues. The room slowly came back to life. But something had changed. Earlier that afternoon, the recruits had seen a wounded soldier walk into the room and assumed she didn't belong there. Now they understood something important. Sometimes the quietest person in the room is the one with the most experience. And sometimes the person everyone doubts is the one who has already faced the battles others have only studied. As the lesson resumed, the wounded soldier quietly returned to her seat in the back. But this time, no one whispered. No one laughed. Instead, several recruits glanced back at her with a new expression. Respect. And in the training hall that day, every soldier learned a lesson far more valuable than the one written in their manuals. Some warriors don't need to announce who they are. Their actions speak for them. And their silence speaks even louder.